Good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, good night, whenever you're listening to this. Welcome back to the video lecture series on the sociology of globalization. I'm going to pick right up where I left off last time, and that's discussing the nature of the relationship between social structure and globalization. So in chapter 2 here in the David Newman textbook on pages 23 and 24, you're introduced to this term globalization for the first time. Out of our two textbooks, this definition is by far the more simple, direct definition, and you'll see why momentarily. So Newman defines globalization as the increasingly interconnectedness of people's lives all around the world, economically, politically, environmentally, and culturally. So three of those words have a lot more to do with each other than the other one, and those are economically, politically, and culturally, since those are all parts of social structure. And two of the words have a lot more to do with each other than the other two. That would be economically and politically, because those are two types of social institutions. Now, in chapter 9, in the section on globalization and institutions, Newman discusses economics or the economy as a social institution related to globalization, but he doesn't discuss politics. I've always wondered why that's the case. It seems like if you're going to define a term using the increasing interconnectedness of people's lives, that you might want to use the term, you might want to follow up with that in chapter 9, but he doesn't do that. I don't know why, that's up to him, but he does cover education as a social institution and religion as a social institution. Now, at this point, my concern is more with your ability to identify the social structures involved in the discussion. So at this point, we're simply talking about social institutions in general and how they're related to globalization. So what we can do with this idea of social structure is begin to map out the social world around us in terms of the broad scale contexts or situations that we find ourselves in. So as a child, a lot of the context of your life was related to family and education. Think about where and with whom you spent most of your time as a child, either with your family or at school. And probably somebody in your family, like mom or dad or whoever was taking care of you, was going to work. And they probably went shopping for groceries or tires for their car or a new car or clothes or entertainment like TVs and video games and things like that. So taking part in the economy. Government or politics and law or the state, as we'll come to find out it's called in sociology, is a defining feature of most of our lives. You have taxes and rules that we call laws or regulations or legal codes upheld by law enforcement. Military is a very important institution related to politics and law in the state. Mass media is another very important social institution, just like religion, medicine, healthcare, science, technology, arts, communication, transportation, sports, leisure, and various other social institutions that contextualize our lives. At the other end of the spectrum, from macro to micro, our positions in society are related to the social institutions that we're taking part in within our groups. And our groups can take different forms. Two broad ones are in groups and out groups, who we like, who we don't like, and primary groups and secondary groups. People who we like because we like them, they like us, and people who we work with because we want to complete a task. This is where organizations come into play. Organizations are large-scale formal groups. They're actually networks of statuses and groups that come together to perform tasks that individuals and small groups can't accomplish themselves. So there are many, 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 many organizations, a dozen, a couple dozen social institutions, countless groups, and probably a definite amount of statuses and roles. But that's the map of the social world that I want you to know. Newman wants you to know it too, and chapter 9 is all about that. But he leads up to this idea of globalization, which is the topic of this course. So the two most important aspects of social structure for David Newman are right there in the title of chapter 9. The structure of society, organizations, social institutions, and globalization. I want to back up for just a second, though, and interrogate this idea of society. Have you ever thought about what this word society actually means? We sociologists can give you a definition like the one right here, where it's a population of humans, I might add, living in the same or similar geographic territory, sharing an identity, sharing a culture, and probably being ruled over by a government. But let's check out a couple key terms in George Ritzer's book, particularly related to chapter 5. This is where we're introduced to the idea of the nation state, something you might call a country. The definition of the nation state is that it's something that integrates subgroups that think of themselves as the nation with the organizational structure of the state. But what is that? Well, there's two parts to the nation state, the nation and the state. The nation is much more like society. It's the people within a country. The country is the geographic territory plus the government, or what we might call the state. The state is the government. Oftentimes, the state or the government controls public education, instilling nationalism through pledges of allegiance, singing the national anthem, and teaching the government's history. That's not a bad thing at all. But think about this. The nation can have a sense of national identity, thinking of oneself not in terms of the flag or pledges of allegiance, but more in terms of the history of a people, the way the people are, the accent, the dialect, what people eat, how people dress, how people greet each other, depart, and mourn the dead. That's very much like society. Just like a state or government, society is not a culture. Culture is a feature of society. Societies are not civilizations, and civilization is not culture. Civilizations like the West or Western civilization include many different societies spread out across a lot of different countries with a lot of different governments or states operating over them. So I'd like you to keep that in mind as we progress throughout the course. Now, let's take a look at George Ritzer's definition of globalization. Now, I have no problem remembering from the top of my head David Newman's definition, the process through which people's lives all around the world become increasingly interconnected economically, politically, environmentally, and culturally. Ritzer's is a little bit different. It's a little bit more difficult to memorize. His definition is the transplanetary process or set of processes involving the increasing liquidity and the growing multi-directional flows of people, objects, places, and information, as well as the structures they encounter and create that are barriers to or expedite those flows. That's a mouthful. It's also a lot to take in conceptually. So this is one reason why I prefer to work with David Newman's definitions, because his are designed for a 100 level course, which of course this is. George Ritzer's book is more appropriate for the junior or senior level course, but it's the one that was selected for this course by the person who designed it. So we're kind of stuck with it. But that's why I've done what I've done on our Moodle course page to provide you a lot of resources. So you'll see that I've included the PowerPoint chapter notes for the Newman textbook. You can utilize those if you want. I don't think they're going to be very helpful. You might want to use them to print off and take notes on as you proceed through the videos, where I mention a lot of different concepts, key terms, pages, sections. One thing that you might want to do is go to the glossary for globalization, the essentials, which I'm going to do right now. Print it off so that you can come back and start marking off some of the key concepts that I want you to know about. So one would be this idea of civil society that would be discussed in chapter 5 on political flows. This is a type of society or aspect of society, you might say, is differentiated from the state. It's kind of like the nation. It's those aspects of society that people voluntarily agree to interact within. The section on which I discussed civilization is associated with this idea of cultural differentialism. So we'll approach that. I don't know why, but Ritzer doesn't include civilization as a key term. He really should, but he doesn't, but it's associated with cultural differentialism. Another key term is global civil society. So within any given society, you can have civil society, the nation, you can have the state or government, and those are kind of two separate things, though they are related to each other. But then all around the world, we might see this global civil society. So partnerships between economic forces or partnerships between non-governmental organizations, partnerships between religions or denominations within a global religion. So this thing that is coming into being all across the world based upon voluntary partnerships. Here we see the definition of globalization that was presented in the book, and we see that there are different types of globalization. Globalization from above, globalization from below, glocalization, globalization. We'll be getting into those things, those aspects of globalization that we can start to see have different dynamics depending upon how we look at it. Right here, we can see the terms nation, national identity, nationalism, and nation state. These are very important terms that we have because they help us to clarify what it is specifically that we're thinking about. When we talk about society, we're talking about all the different aspects of social structure, of the processes that go on within that society. So there are different institutions, one of which would be government or politics and the law or the state. This particular social institution is important because it is so different from all the other institutions based upon one key factor, and that is based on the famous sociologist Max Weber's conception of the state. It's very famous. Max Weber conceived of the state as that institution or organization with the monopoly on the legitimate use of force and violence. No other organization or institution gets to impose its will through the use of coercion or threats of force, but the government or the state does. So again, according to Max Weber, the important aspect of the state is its monopoly on violence. And I have a video specifically on that topic in the course playlist where I introduce Max Weber's theories, one of which deals directly with a concept called bureaucracy. And this is where David Newman first introduces you to Max Weber in this section on bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is a formal type of an organizational structure. We're all familiar with it. We were born into a bureaucracy called a hospital. We were educated in bureaucracies called schools. We come to our faith oftentimes in bureaucracy called churches. And then we go and earn a living in bureaucracies in some occupation, typically that has rules, a hierarchy of authority, a division of labor, defined statuses and roles such as bosses, supervisors, managers, employees, subordinates, custodians, executive administrative assistants, and so on and so forth. So this is my main man, Max Weber. He's my favorite sociologist. He doesn't have to be yours by far, but he is mine. He's a very important sociologist, and he comes up a couple different times in chapter 9. First of all, he comes up when discussing bureaucracies. Again, the state is a specific type of bureaucracy that has what? It has the monopoly on violence. That's right. So the next time that we see Weber's name, it's in this section on globalization and social institutions, but there's something odd going on here. David Newman defines globalization as the process through which people's lives become increasingly interconnected all across the world, economically, politically, environmentally, and culturally. Then he says, see chapter 9 for more detail. We go to chapter 9. There's a section on economics, but there's no section on politics or the state. It's kind of mysterious. Maybe not, maybe so. I don't know, it's up to you. But I kind of find it strange. He does discuss education, and he also discusses religion. And in doing so, he brings up my main man, Max Weber, and his famous study on the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Essentially, what Weber was doing was he was analyzing why it is that a certain type or form of capitalism began to express itself in industrialized societies that had more substantiated forms of Protestantism or more people practicing Protestantism. Now, you can read his book for that analysis, but essentially what he said was because of the beliefs and the values, or we might think of that as culture, because of the cultural values and norms of Protestants, they began to practice capitalism in a certain type of way. And so it was the beliefs or the ideas that affected the material ways that people produced goods and services, began to reinvest their profits, and develop the modern form of capitalism as we see it. Now, I'll come back to this idea of why it is that Newman defines globalization in terms of economics and politics. But then in that section, he discusses religion, education, and a lot of material is dedicated to economics. But we'll come back to that idea when we start to address chapter 10, which he references on the right-hand column in the section where he discusses multinational corporations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization. So we'll pick back up on this at a later time and date.